Now, please welcome Dr. Howard Evans back to Fully Scored to speak about The Old Wells by Eric Ball.
Thank you very much, Howard, for joining us once again on Fully Scored. I can't believe it, but it's been almost 2 years since we recorded our analysis in person of the Holy War and your interview. And, the world's changed quite a bit since then, hasn't it?
I don't think we quite knew what was coming, although things were on the way. But I think it was less than 3-4 weeks after we'd sat and discussed the Holy War over the dining room table. The world ended up being locked down, and we've been living in a very different world since then.
So the piece that you've chosen to look at today is Eric Ball's The Old Wells. Why have you chosen this piece to look at in particular?
I think there were a few reasons. Simon obviously sent me the list of works that had been looked at in the intervening period since we did the Holy War, and there wasn't a great deal of representation of the variation form on there. And in fact, one of the pieces that I used at the day that we had for TMS this last summer was in fact to introduce the Old Wells. Most of the students in the band that I had there for that day had never come across the work or played it before. And again, I just thought maybe for aspiring composers, some of our young writers, I wondered whether maybe it was a really useful piece to look at in terms of the clarity of its structure, its composition, and the fact that in its day it was quite a groundbreaking work. We tend to lose the focus of that with hindsight, and in a way it could look a little bit simplistic for us these days in terms of some of the variation forms that have been published over recent years, and there's some of the complexities of that. And yet in its day it was a very, very different set of variations in terms of the way Eric Ball wrote this and what he actually intended.
And I believe you have a personal connection with Eric Ball as well.
Yes, I suppose it's not something that you kind of say too much about, but you could say Eric is family in that Eric was my grandmother's cousin. Where we lived at Leigh-on-Sea for many years, and where my parents still live, we actually, when we moved there from Wales, we moved to be next door to my grandmother. And living with my grandmother was my great-grandmother, Esther Ball, who was Eric's aunt and was sister to Eric's father, Jack. If you check the Eric Ball biography out, you'll see the family details in there. My great-grandmother was born Esther Ball, and because of that, there was a family connection whereby Eric would come and did come and see my grandmother. And there was a really lovely story that Mary Randall told me. It was when she and Stan Randall used to look after Eric when they lived in the Bournemouth area. When I became the national bandmaster in 1988, I never forget Mary telling me this lovely, gentle story of Eric, and Mary saying about me being appointed the national bandmaster, and Eric saying, "Well, of course, you know he's a relation of mine." So, which was incredibly kind of him. But we did meet and connected with each other on a number of occasions because of that, and the events that he used to coming to Cobham Hall, coming and taking part in events in the bands department even before I went into training. I also, as a cadet, my summer out training was at Fordingbridge Corps, and I wrote a march for my session and for our sessional band to play called Servants of God. And so I did actually take the march, because I was at Fordingbridge, just north of Bournemouth. I did actually get in touch with Eric and went and spent an afternoon with him and Olive at their place in Milton Road. And he very kindly looked over my very first Salvation Army march for me. And was very generous, very kind about it. But also there was the bass solo section that I'd written. he suggested that I needed a slightly more transparent and less thick and heavy figures in the upper part to the bass solo section that I'd written. So I duly went back and rescored it and changed it and kind of had slightly more pyramid structures that worked with this march. As opposed to the thick structures that I'd got at Eric's suggestion. He was very kind about it, very lovely about it, but he did have some really helpful suggestions in terms of what I was actually doing. So yes, kind of some very strong personal memories in that way, although these days I think there's lots of things. I was very much in awe of him in that kind of way, in my 20s in that way. And I guess there's lots of things I'd love to ask him these days if I got the chance again to go and meet him. But I remember being quite almost tongue-tied in some ways, but just very much in awe of the man, despite the kind of personal connection in that way in the family relationship.
And where did this piece come in Eric Ball's output?
It's fairly early on. There are one or two other pieces in the festival series before this, but it comes at about 1930, and there are a few other variations by one or two other folks before this, but the variation form tends to be, and even some of the solos that come before this, like Eric Lightston's Happy Day, they're very much more in the traditional variation form of that time, sort of Acca Carnival of Venice style, whereby the variations follow those patterns of the way you kind of sort of develop the tune. Whereas even in his notes, in the score notes, Eric actually says that as a simple air varie, this piece is hardly true to type, as it relies more upon thematic as opposed to melodic development than is usual. Hence, it approximates more nearly to the form known as symphonic variations. He doesn't say that it is a set of symphonic variations in the way that we would understand that now, but it approximates more to that kind of work. So it's very much the motivic development. That was something that we spoke about an awful lot in RSA's The Holy War, where there was a huge amount of motivic development. The motivic development is in the work, is in the variations, and it's actually quite clear to see. And so all the variations get developed thematically in that kind of way. And it was a trend that was then followed by other people, like Phil Catlin, another piece of his that has kind of sort of was very much of its time, but we don't hear much of these days, was his little variations on a sunbeam, which is, again, quite a classic piece of this particular era. Eric's Old Wells was in 1930, and Phil Catlin's Sunbeam was 1937.
Fantastic. Thank you for that insight into the context of the piece. Let's have a delve into the score now and see what we can pick out from here. Listeners, as always, can purchase the score on the Salvation Army Music Index if you wish to listen and follow along at home. So, the start of the piece, quite traditionally, we start with an introduction.
It's a very beautiful introduction, and the introduction, it's quite clear. It simply starts off with, you could almost call it a chorale in modern day terms, but it's the tune of the original song, and it's very, very smooth, very chorale-like, and a few bars before it suddenly becomes full band and the sound warms through. There's a really lovely trombone quartet. Typical Salvation Army writing in terms of writing for a trombone quartet. and having two first trombone parts there to create that. So you get the original verse of the song, and then at letter A, the theme, the main theme that is developed comes from letter A and is the chorus of the song. The chorus of the song is a little bit different to the to the opening, very much that chorale-like opening, but then it's a brighter chorus feature at letter A. There's almost very lyrical movements in the bass line, with an interesting octave jump. There's a counter melody in the solo horn, baritone and euphonium part, and it repeats twice. And I'm afraid I'm of that generation that know the words of this. The chorus actually says, "Go back to the old wells where the waters are sweet." And that's the thematic stuff that is used for development throughout the piece.
So that takes us to letter B, variation 1. What happens here?
This is quite a delicate variation. In the cornet line at the beginning, you can see how it's related to the thematic parts at letter A, based around, it kind of moves around the main notes of the theme, the F up to the C, the D, the A, the C, and some of the intervals are there. But it's a very, very delicate theme, and there's quite a lot of imitation, and I suppose this is the kind of unusual bit in that you look at the imitation, and the imitation is actually in the basses, the E flat and the B flat basses. The semiquaver, delicate melodic line of the cornet and the soprano at the beginning is then taken up by the tubas, and every couple of bars they imitate each other. And my guess is at its time that would have been quite a challenge and would have been quite different in concept and sound. It's also one of those interesting things, I think, for us today, because I think it's these kind of things that makes the piece quite a classically orientated piece. And having looked at it and having used it a number of times, from a performance point of view, there's almost a classical feel to it, whereby it needs a very delicate and lightness of touch. So whereas at the end of this first variation it's marked forte, it's not a heavy forte and needs a lot of delicacy and refinement, I think, to try and bring this kind of music off. And that's what happens through letter A. That imitation goes right through and repeats. And from a performance point of view, there's a very interesting feature at the end of this variation, just before letter C, where there's a bass line that just moves down the tonic, the fifth and the tonic. And I've heard numerous performances of this where it becomes very bombastic, and it kind of loses the refinement and the lightness of touch that goes with it. Because it's forte and it's got some staccato and some accents marked on it, it ends up being kind of sort of beaten into the ground, is how you hear that. In a way, the variation is very lightly scored. They're just alternating groups in terms of the way they answer each other. And there's a real clarity in the composition in terms of its style and the way that it's written. You can very easily hear the motivic development, but it's a very light, bright variation.
And from light and bright, we changed the mood quite substantially in letter C for variation 2.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. in that he takes. We get a 4-bar phrase, and again, it's absolutely clear where it comes from. If you look at the end of the tune in the forte section at letter A at the end of the tune, where you have the descending figure, dim bum bum ba ba bum bum bum, he turns that motive into a ground bass and uses that tim tam pim pam tam 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 tam, and that tune becomes that, and it does become a ground bass. For people who are kind of wanting to know what your ground bass is, you've only got to think of the ground bass that always occurs to me is Dido's Lament, Purcell's Dido's Lament, where the harmony and the music keeps moving around that ground bass that keeps chugging along underneath. And the ground bass repeats 4 times in the opening section, various different scoring, various lines that come above it and that decorate it and amplify it, and it moves up through the scoring. It's a beautiful little phrase that he keeps using. And then for the second half of the section, the ground bass is inverted. It's turned upside down and moves the opposite way. The inversion of the ground bass starts in the upper parts with a pedal note, letter D, and then gradually moves down. It moves from the solo cornet down into the horn and the baritone, down into the euphonium and the trombone, and then the inversion finishes off with the basses finally moving. There's a beautiful arch in terms of the way the scoring works through there. The climactic point at letter D, when I say climactic, I mean in terms of the scoring. In terms of the volume, it's actually it's a very, very quiet part of the music. There's quite a reticence and quite a delicacy again to the way this works. So you can easily see the theme, but the whole structure of it is quite beautiful, as well as having a lovely kind of overall cohesive structure in terms of the way that it works.
And taking us into letter E, the music dies away to end the second variation and takes us into this renewed energy and vigour of variation 3.
Variation 3, it's a joyous variation. If anybody wants to look at the score notes are by Eric Ball, which is always very helpful, and in that way it's very clear as to what he's saying and what he wants. He says an almost boisterous spirit, and we have the thematic references, and it's actually I think this is almost a dance-like variation. That's what after the ground bass, which is a very serious and quiet variation, this becomes very dance-like, and you get the motivic elements. And again, it's based around the scalic figure of the tune and the intervals going from the 5th to the 3rd, and then back up to the 6th, back to the 3rd of the scale, and ending on the 5th. It's quite compressed here in its 6/8 rhythm, and works over a 2-bar phrase, and as it goes through into letter F, he takes that 2-bar phrase and compresses it even more, and just uses the scalic figures and splits it up, and then inverts some of those things. There's a real clarity of purpose in terms of the way he actually uses the material and the way that it works and the way that it's split between the parts. and the way the thematic figures are used between the voices at letter F. It's very clear, and it's really good. And again, I think this is a movement that doesn't have to be forced too much stylistically in terms of its playing, the kind of lightness. It's got 40 crescendos, but if you make those too bombastic, it destroys the spirit of the music again.
Here are some brief words from Eric Ball introducing his piece, The Old Wells.
Another air varie, as we used to call them, the Old Wells, based on a song, the words of which are by the late General Osborne, and the tune was by a Brigadier Dalziel, who later went to Canada. It's a very good tune, well formed, and was quite suitable for making variations. There's a ground-based theme at C built up. There's a steady allegro in humorous mood in which the euphonium is featured. There's an adagio, which is quite difficult to play, and then of course the finale. Two friends of mine who in their early days had been Salvationists but had not strayed away but had gone to other churches, went to a Salvation Army festival, heard the band play the Old Wells with the feeling of the words, "Go back to the old wells where the waters are sweet." They were quite moved by it and decided to become Salvationists again.
Now it's over to Howard Evans, who's going to be continuing his analysis from letter G. For those who are interested to know, the interspersed excerpts of music are taken from the ISB Heritage Series recording.
So that takes us into letter G and our fourth variation. Again, a very different style here. Could you talk us through some of the differences and new nuances we see in this section?
This is a really interesting section in that you get short phrases that are really contrasted. There really is quite a sense of drama about this in terms of the way that it works. The thematic bits are absolutely clear, but when you hear the work, the thematic bits are kind of integrated into the texture, that the chord structures that he puts around the thematic bits become more kind of preeminent in terms of what you're actually hearing, and almost disguises the thematic bit that actually comes through in this. It's really interesting, and it's some of the more difficult bits in that the two bars that the answering two bars, you get an entry by the solo horn that is always well known for being very exposed, even for modern day players, and then there are some solo figures, some solo semi-quaver figures with the solo cornet and soprano that are interlinked, that are almost cadenza-like in terms of the way they fit. You get this dramatic, loud figure with the thematic figure, and then you get this two-bar answering cadenza-like fragment. There's a very interesting little bit connected with this. I did do kind of one or two checks about this, and Brindley Boone talks about this in his own book, in his own reminiscences. It's the best of both worlds. I mean, Brindley has to be kind of one of the sources for lots of things, partly because of his ISB history book, the music playbook, and his own biography. He was actually in between jobs and was desperately trying to get another job. He'd lost his first job, and he'd heard rather quietly on the side that there was a vacancy in the accounts department of SP&S, and was interested, but he had been told that the requirement of the job was that you could play the soprano cornet. This was 1934, in the days of the SP&S band, and they were obviously looking for somebody in the accounts department, but they were also looking for somebody who could play the soprano cornet. So Brindley Boone went to Judd Street and was auditioned by Captain Eric Ball, and Eric obviously knew who Brindley was, and his biography says there was a puzzled expression on his face as he smiled and greeted me and said, "I didn't know you played soprano." I replied, "I don't, but I want a job." Anyway, as part of this, he started off, and Eric Ball asked him to play Rockingham, which he did, commencing on C, and Eric Ball asked him to put it up a fourth, which took him up to the top F. And Brindley Boone says, "I shall never forget the pained look on the face of the examiner as I struggled to reach that lofty, hitherto unexplored pinnacle. Sight reading from the captain's air varie, the old wells followed." So Brindley Boone actually had to sight read some of the parts of this for an audition that he didn't succeed at to join the SP&S band. I think there is, on the Regal Zonophone site, there's a recording of the SP&S band, and he describes it as what an ordeal, and he didn't expect to hear anything more and wasn't disappointed, and some weeks later heard the successful applicant playing at an associated headquarters festival with the SP&S band. So fascinating to see that Eric Ball actually used some of the difficulties of the piece that I'm possibly talking about here as an audition piece for Brindley Boone auditioning for soprano in the SP&S band. Apparently the work was first played in 1929. It was published in 1930, but it was first played in 1929, and you can find out about that, and there are so many things that you find out about this in Brindley Boone's story of the International Staff Band, one of the first volumes. And it was in 1929 he talks about the manuscript works by Eric Ball being heard that night. The two new works by Eric Ball at the Rink Festival that year were the Meditation St Anne and the Air Varie, the Old Wells. The fascinating thing here is that the reporter, I presume that the reporter, and this was reported in the Bandsman and Songter as it might have been in those days, the reporter described it as a brilliant Stravinsky-like number. That's the quotation that Brindley Boone's got in his history of the ISB. Now, nowhere reading through this piece would I think of this piece as being a Stravinsky-like number, unless that bombastic stuff that some people think of is what they're thinking of. Maybe they're thinking of some of the bombastic moments of The Rite of Spring. Who knows? But I would never have described it as being a Stravinsky-like number in that kind of way, because I think the thing that we all associate with Eric and his music is actually the sort of Elgarian context of his music, and that sort of quintessentially sort of English Elgar-like style. I mean, there was that affinity with Elgar whereby he transcribed the whole of the Enigma variations, the Froissart Overture. I think he also did the prelude to the Dream of Gerontius, as well as one or two other works. There's the Checkmate dances that he took from Arthur Bliss's music that he scored and published for band as well. So I think most of us associate Eric with Elgar in that kind of way. In fact, There is even a story, and this is in Eric's own biography. And my guess is that this piece, just backtracking to the ISB premiering this work, the SBS band was formed in 1928. I can't imagine that I can't find any record of it, but there is that recording on Regal's Zonophone of the SBS band playing this piece. But I can't imagine, if the SBS band was formed in 1928, I can't imagine that Eric wouldn't have tried the piece through with the SBS band, although the manuscript was first played, which I guess was the tradition in those days. The manuscript was first played by the ISB at the Rink Festival in 1929, and then the work was published in 1930. But the connection with Elgar, apparently the SBS band, I'm not quite sure when this was, there's no date given reference for this, but the SBS band played the Old Wells at a concert, and the organist of Canterbury Cathedral asked Eric for a copy of the score. Elgar was a personal friend of the organist of Canterbury Cathedral, and apparently Elgar wrote to Eric saying that it was free and sane and open airish, all three good objectives, and that it was a splendid piece of brass band scoring. So those kind of that description of the piece from the report of the festival as it being Stravinsky-like actually has no bearing on the structure and the kind of music, and that connection with Elgar actually kind of almost attested to by Elgar himself, who gave Eric Ball's Old Wells the thumbs up, very much so. So a little bit of a digression there, but a fascinating background, moving from Brindley and the soprano part at letter G through to Elgar's own appreciation of the music and the score of the Old Wells.
And testimony to the quality of the music, we're here today, nearly 100 years on, still speaking about it.
Absolutely.
So, Variation 5, at letter H, is our next section. Can you talk us through this?
Letter H, we actually come to the final variation, and Eric himself says in his notes, a well-marked rhythmic swing and confidence in attacking the various rhythmic features. So it's this, again, the thematic development, and again, it is the thematic development from the first four bars. In the ground bass, we had the thematic development from the end of the tune, but very much throughout the whole of the piece, and that's where you might say it's a little bit underdeveloped, because the thematic variation again comes right from those opening four bars, and in more modern works you might find a greater sort of thematic development and other sections of tunes being used in different ways. But again, it's those first four bars that provide the first four bars of this figure around that opening of the tune. 4-bar phrase from the tubas, full band answering phrase, dance-like phrases, and you get it's modulatory passages that are quite clearly kind of taken us somewhere in terms of where we go. He then compresses those and shorten those, takes the beginning of that motive that he starts this movement off with, lots of imitative things. It's a really useful lesson, I think, for us as composers in terms of how some of these things are done. The way ideas are used sparingly, and the way ideas are kind of brought, and each little idea is mined for itself rather than introducing lots of new and different ideas. So halfway through that section, the figure becomes compressed and shortened, and it gets shortened even more with the kind of scalic little bits that you get in the 8 bars before I, with the trombone feature and the cornet feature. Everything kind of gets shortened. It gives a kind of rhythmic intensity and direction in terms of where the music actually moves. At letter I, you get the descending figure again, that's kind of turned into a chromatic descending figure, but it's definitely the descending figure that we had from the tune, where it starts and where it comes down to. And again, you get fragments of that, answering fragments of that, so you get descending chromatic figure, and then you get that answered by the ascending chromatic figures, 2-bar answering phrases, and again that whole section repeats itself and takes us into letter J. His score notes at letter J, he says a solo part for the E-flat bass is a feature of the section, should be rendered with some amount of abandon. He's on about the horn and trombone parts and the balance, and talks about B-flat bass players rendering their staccato notes quasi pits in the style of the pluck string on the cello or double bass. Now those notes in the score, that's what tells me that this is kind of classical in conception, in terms of refinement, in terms of the way we need to play it. The score notes make it sound orchestral in conception and has to be treated in that kind of way. Again, the unusual thing I think here is actually having a solo for the E-flat bass. I think for lots of us of later generations, I think if you think E-flat bass solos, we all automatically think of Les Condon's Call of the Righteous and the E-flat bass solo that features in that. And yet, here we are in 1929 with a cantabile E-flat bass solo that develops through these first 24 bars of letter J. Really, really long developed solo that kind of moves up by a semitone each time, moves up half a tone each time with the... and again, even the divisi of the bass with those pizzicato notes in the B-flat bass that are meant to be very light and very delicate and quasi-pits. And it takes us into another 4-bar phrase that then brings us to a dramatic writ before we come to a final presentation of the theme. The E-flat bass solo quite clearly again taken from the beginning of this movement, but in a more lyrical style in terms of the way that it actually works. You've got the dance-like style at letter H that becomes a much more lyrical style through here.
So, as you've just alluded to, letter K, we come to the reprise of the original chorus, followed by a swift coda at letter L.
Yep. Really nice to have the representation of the tune here at the end. Nothing different from the beginning in terms of the way it works, but then the final conclusion. You do have this molto allegro for the coda, and the kind of sort of one in a bar feel really kind of makes that final chord that you get at letter L as it's really a kind of, well, Eric says in his core notes, think of the first 5 bars of being the final chord of the main theme, and then you get this accompaniment, you get this final fragment of this dance-like theme in the bottom part of the band that gives us the final chords, and then into a final pause and a final conclusion. A spirit of exuberant happiness is what he says. So you get that final motive, a final sense of joy, which I guess replicates go back to the old wells where the waters are sweet, the sense of joy that comes from the song, having taken us through all sorts of moods along the way, dance-like moves, dramatic moves, quiet moods, reflective moods, the drama of the recitative, the cadenza-like section in the middle, and the dark chords that you get in the middle. There's quite a range of styles and colours that come through this in that kind of way.
Fantastic, and an excellent conclusion to an excellent piece and an excellent analysis. Thank you ever so much, Howard, for talking us through that piece. It's been a pleasure to have you on Fully Scored once again.
Thank you very much. Again, it's just been fascinating to check through. I'm just so glad I've had some of those reference bits on my shelves, because some of the things that you're kind of looking at and that you're trying to find out, they're not sort of sat online waiting for you just to discover, and you have to kind of sort of be patient in terms of trying to find out some of the background to some of these things and have to work a little bit harder to what's going on. There are all sorts of, if you do a quick search on Regal Zonophone, which is always a fascinating site for finding out what is there for recordings. There is a recording on there of the SP&S band actually playing this work. So the SP&S band, for its 12 years, was conducted by Eric Ball. The death knell of the SP&S band was obviously the start of the Second World War, and the band folded because a lot of the players ended up being called up to go to war. And obviously that was the end of the SP&S band. When things came back after the war, things were very different. Again, it was a different world. It's a bit like, I suppose, where we are now, in that we're not really post-COVID, but after these last couple of years since we last met, we're in a very different place. But it would be very interesting to listen to and to compare. I haven't had time to go through and compare all of those recordings, but obviously it would be fascinating to listen to Eric conducting his own composition, and how that actually works, and how he actually puts that together, and the style. There's obviously a very interesting feature with that. I think I'm not sure whether we spoke about it earlier before we started this, but this whole performance practice issue, and obviously the instruments were very different in those days, much smaller mouthpieces, smaller bores, quite a different sound to what we expect from brass bands these days. And it's always difficult with those recordings to know how much of the sound, or difficult to know how much of the sound is the instruments and how much of the sound is the quality of the recording. And maybe we ought to resurrect an SP&S band with a set of old instruments to see what some of these pieces might have sounded like on their set of instruments and in high pitch in those days. All sorts of facets that give a very different performance practice to what might have been, but we do have a fascinating insight, and that's where something like the Regal Zonophone website is really interesting in terms of being able to compare and contrast recordings. That's probably something that could work for another time, in the sense that there's a whole heap of work in regard to that would take quite a few moments to work through of itself. But that's something that people can go and have a look at and just find out for themselves, and how different some of those recordings are. Stylistically, I've spoken about this before, stylistically, how we approach the sense of performance practice, because if we're not careful, we tend to play and conductors tend to conduct things the way they've heard them before, instead of saying, what does the score tell me about the way this works? What do I do here? Where does some of the performance practice come from? That's not to say that it's not correct, but sometimes there's more than one way of looking at things and interpreting the score. And for the old Wells, that would be another fascinating exercise as well.
Thank you, Howard, for your time preparing that analysis. A really insightful look into such a well-established piece now in our repertoire.